More income is supposed to reduce risk. That is the belief most people never question. But if that were true, households with two full-time earners would feel stable. They would feel protected. They would feel in control. Many do not. If both of you are working yet, one missed paycheck would immediately change your life. This is not about spending habits. It is not about discipline, and it is not something you were warned about. There is a structure beneath modern finances that quietly converts income into dependency. It does not announce itself. It does not feel dangerous at first. And by the time it becomes visible, most families are already locked inside it. To understand why this keeps happening, we have to strip the story down to its structure and examine how each layer quietly locks into the next. The story always started with simple arithmetic. If one person earning $50,000 could support a family in the past, then two people earning $50,000 each should do more than survive. They should save, they should invest, they should build wealth faster. On paper, that logic is flawless. One income becomes two, 50 becomes 100. Scarcity should disappear. That assumption became one of the most powerful narratives in modern personal finance. Two incomes were framed as progress, as safety, as resilience, as the rational response to rising costs and economic uncertainty. By the early 2020s, that belief had fully solidified into a social default. Female labor force participation stabilized around 57%. Among married couples with children, well over 60% had both parents working full-time. The second income was no longer optional, it was normalized. And with normalization came expectation. Banks began underwriting mortgages based on combined income. Lenders approved loans not on what one income could safely carry, but on what two incomes could theoretically sustain. Employers assumed constant availability from both partners. School districts priced housing around dual-earner purchasing power. At the household level, the math looked reassuring. A couple earning $70,000 and $50,000 sees a combined income of $120,000. That number feels large. It feels safe. It feels like margin. But gross income is not usable income. Once federal taxes, payroll taxes, and state taxes are applied, that combined figure compresses quickly. In many states, a household earning $120,000 retains closer to $85,000 after tax. That reduction happens before a single bill is paid, and households do not build their lives around after-tax numbers. They build around what lenders, employers, and social norms signal they can afford. The result is predictable. Must expand to meet the larger headline income. Housing scales up, transportation scales up, childcare enters the budget as a structural requirement rather than a choice. Health insurance premiums rise with employment. Dependency, convenience spending fills the gaps left by exhaustion. None of this feels reckless in isolation. Each decision appears rational when viewed through the lens of combined income. But taken together, they form a system. A system where the second income is no longer surplus. It is pre-spent. Before any saving occurs, before any investing begins, before any margin is created, this is the moment where the promise breaks. Because once both incomes are committed to maintaining baseline life, there is no buffer left, no unused capacity, no financial elasticity. The household looks strong from the outside, but structurally, it is operating at full load, and systems that operate at full load do not fail gradually. They fail suddenly. That assumption feels reasonable until you look at what actually happened when it was tested against real households, real failures, and real financial collapse. The term for this pattern did not come from Venus or internet forums. It came from bankruptcy court in the early 2000s. A Harvard bankruptcy law professor began noticing something that contradicted everything personal finance culture assumed. Families filing for bankruptcy were not reckless spenders. They were not dominated by single-income households. They were overwhelmingly middle class, and increasingly, they had two paychecks. After analyzing more than 2,000 bankruptcy cases, the conclusion was clear. Two-income families were not safer. They were more exposed. That finding became the foundation of what would later be called the two-income trap. The key insight was not that families earned too little. Adjusted for inflation, median household income had risen compared to the 1970s. The problem was that income growth and risk exposure were moving in opposite directions. In a single-income household, income and capacity were separated. One income paid the bills, the second potential income remained unused. That unused capacity acted as insurance. It could be activated during illness, unemployment, or disruption. In a dual-income household, that separation disappeared. By the time both incomes became standard, the economy had already adapted. Housing markets priced homes based on what two earners could afford. Employers structured schedules around constant availability. Mixed costs adjusted upward to match the new purchasing power. The second income stopped being a buffer, it became a requirement. This shift changed the failure dynamics entirely. In a system with margin, shocks are absorbed. In a system without margin, shocks propagate. A temporary income disruption does not reduce comfort. It destabilizes. This is why bankruptcy data told a different story than income data. Two-income households were more likely to collapse because they had fewer ways to adapt when something went wrong. They were operating closer to the edge. The math explains why a household earning $120,000 appears robust. But once fixed, costs consume 80 to 90% of after-tax income. Resilience disappears. At that point, income volatility does not cause inconvenience. It causes insolvency. By the late 2010s, this fragility became visible at scale. Federal Reserve surveys consistently showed that a significant share of American adults could not cover a $400 emergency without borrowing, selling assets, or missing payments. Many of those households were dual-income households with stable employment histories. They were not failing because of irresponsibility. They were failing because the system required full deployment of all income just to remain solvent. This is the core of the trap. Not that two incomes are bad, but that once both incomes are required for survival, the household loses its last line of defense. From that point forward, stability becomes conditional. And conditional stability is not stability at all. To understand why this pattern even became possible, you have to look at how households were structured before the second income stopped being a backup and became a requirement. To understand how this happened, you have to step back to a period when the system was built around a different assumption. In 1970, fewer than half of adult women participated in the labor force. The typical middle-class household relied on one primary income, not because families were wealthier, but because the structure of costs allowed it. Housing was the anchor. Census and labor data from that period show that the median household spent roughly a quarter of its income on housing. That ratio mattered more than the price itself. It meant the largest fixed cost in a family's life left room for everything else. Healthcare was simpler and cheaper. Per capita health spending in 1970 was a fraction of what it is today, even after adjusting for inflation. Employer-based coverage existed, but dependence on constant full-time employment was lower because one partner was not already fully deployed in the labor market. Childcare was not a line item. Domestic labor was performed inside the household. That work had economic value, but it did not require cash outflow, time substituted for money. Most importantly, income and risk were decoupled. The household operated on one income, but it possessed the latent capacity of a second. That capacity did not show up on a tax return. It did not inflate borrowing limits, but it existed as margin. If the primary earner lost their job, the second adult could enter the workforce. If illness struck, labor allocation could shift. If hours were cut, income could be supplemented. The system had elasticity. This mattered because shocks were not rare. Job loss, health issues, and economic downturns were as common then as they are now. The difference was how households absorbed them. A single-income household with low fixed costs could downshift temporarily. Spending could be reduced without immediate collapse. Mortgage payments were smaller relative to income. Transportation costs were lower. There were fewer cash-dependent services required to keep daily life functioning. The backup plan was not theoretical. That structure created resilience even without high income. The household did not need to predict every risk. It only needed enough unused capacity to respond when risk arrived. Contrast that with the modern dual-income household. The backup plan is already deployed. Both adults are working. Time has been converted into cash and then locked into fixed obligation. When disruption occurs, there is no remaining capacity to activate. The difference is not cultural, it is mathematical. When fixed costs are designed to be covered by one income, a second income increases safety. When fixed costs are designed to require two incomes, safety disappears. That is, the baseline the modern system abandoned. And everything that follows flows from that decision. Once that backup was activated by default, the system didn't stay the same. It recalibrated, rounded, and costs began to move accordingly. Once the second income became standard, costs did not merely rise. They reorganized by the early 2020s. The median US household earned roughly $74,000 a year, adjusted for inflation. That was meaningfully higher than in 1970. On the surface, income appeared to be keeping up, cost told a different story. Housing moved first. In inflation-adjusted terms, the median home price in 1970 was just over $200,000 in today's money. By 2023, the median home price pushed past $400,000. The ratio changed. Housing no longer consumed a quarter of income. In many metro areas, it demanded 35 to 40%, even before taxes. House DA followed in 1970. Per capita health spending was roughly $2,000 in today's dollars. By 2023, it exceeded $14,000 per person. For a family of 4, that is not an abstract statistic. It translates into premiums, deductibles, co-pays, and employer dependence that locks both adults into continuous full-time work. Then came childcare in the single-income era. Childcare costs were mostly internalized through time. In the dual-income era, they became cash expenses. By the early 2020s, average childcare costs exceeded $11,000 per child per year. In high-cost regions, that number routinely crossed $20,000. These were not discretionary upgrade, they were structural substitution. Time was replaced with money. Flexibility was replaced with obligation. College tuition more than tripled in real terms since 1980. Even families not actively paying tuition felt the pressure indirectly through savings expectations, housing premiums tied to school districts, and competitive signaling around opportunity. What matters is not that each category became more expensive in isolation. It is that they all became fixed. Housing payments are fixed. Fixed health insurance premiums are fixed. Transportation costs expand with commute requirements created by dual employment. These expenses do not scale down easily when income is disrupted. When you stack them together, the pattern becomes visible. The second income did not increase surplus. It increased commitment. Every additional dollar earned by the second worker allowed the household to qualify for larger obligations. And once those obligations were signed, they could not be unwound without severe consequences. This is why income growth did not translate into security. The system absorbed it by the time the paycheck arrived. It already belonged to the structure built around it. Not to savings, not to resilience, not to optionality. And because the absorption happened gradually, it rarely felt like a choice. Each decision was justified by the numbers available at the time. Combined income made it reasonable. Market norms made it expected. Only later did the household discover what had been traded away. Not comfort, but margin. Those shifts look abstract at the macro level, but their impact becomes unavoidable when you translate them into a single household's math. This is where the math stops. Being abstract, take a household with 2 earners. One makes $70,000, the other makes $50,000. On paper, the household earns $120,000 a year. Now isolate the second income, the $50,000. Because of progressive tax brackets, the income is not taxed as if it were the only income. It is taxed on top of the first $70,000. Federal income tax, payroll taxes, and state taxes combine to remove roughly 30 to 35%. Depending on location, that $50,000 becomes approximately $33,000 in take-home pay. If the household has 1 child, childcare enters immediately. National averages put full-time childcare between $12,000 and $15,000 per year. In many metro areas, it is higher. Subtract $14,000. The remaining amount is now $19,000. Next comes transportation. A second full-time job usually means a second commute. Fuel, maintenance, depreciation, insurance, and parking. Add up quickly. Conservative estimates place that cost between $6,000 and $8,000 per year. Use $7,000. The remaining amount drops to $12,000. Now, account for exhaustion. Costs 2 full-time working adults. Have less time for unpaid domestic labor. Care repairs and convenience spending increase. Studies consistently show higher service and food spending in dual-income households. Even modest increases here easily reach $6,000 to $8,000 annually. Use $7,000. The remaining amount is now $5,000. That is the net contribution of a $50,000 income, $5,000 per year, roughly $400 per month, and that is a generous scenario. Add a second child, higher child care costs, longer commutes, or higher state taxes, and the number approaches 0. In many cases, it turns negative. This is not an edge case. It is arithmetic. Someone is working full-time, losing time with family, absorbing stress, burning energy. and the household is retaining the equivalent of a few dollars per hour after all secondary costs are accounted for. Yet the household does not feel poor because the gross number is large. 120,000 looks substantial. It shapes expectations. It shapes borrowing capacity. It shapes lifestyle decisions. Mortgages are approved based on that gross figure. Car loans are structured around it. Fixed costs are sized to it. The household commits to obligations that assume both incomes will continue indefinitely. That is the psychological distortion at the center of the trap. The second income feels like surplus, but it is functioning as infrastructure, and once infrastructure fails, everything attached to it fails at the same time. This is why dual-income households feel stable right up until they are not. There is no gradual warning. There is no slow adjustment. There is only a sudden mismatch between fixed costs and remaining income. At that point, the math stops working, and when the math stops working, intentions no longer matter. As long as nothing goes wrong, that math appears to hold. The problem is what happens the moment reality deviates from the plan. This is where the system reveals its breaking point. In a household where fixed costs are sized for two incomes, income loss is not an inconvenience. It is a structural failure when one income disappears. The household does not lose discretionary spending, it loses solvency. The mortgage payment does not adjust downward. Childcare contracts do not pause. Health insurance premiums do not scale with reduced hours. Car payments, insurance, utilities, and property taxes remain unchanged. The cost structure was built for full deployment. It expects both incomes to arrive on time. Every month, when that expectation breaks, the entire system debises at once. This is why the failure is sudden. In the single-income household of the past, job loss created stress but not immediate collapse. The household could reduce spending. The second adult could enter the workforce. There was unused capacity to activate. The system had slack in the modern dual-income household. That slack is gone. Both adults are already working. There is no reserve labor to deploy. There is no income buffer to activate. The only remaining adjustment mechanism is debt. This is where bankruptcy data becomes critical. When researchers examined why dual-income families were more likely to file for bankruptcy, they did not find evidence of higher consumption. They found higher fixed obligations. These households were not spending more on luxuries. They were spending more on non-negotiables: housing, healthcare, childcare, transportation, the very costs required to participate in the modern middle class. By the late 2010s, this fragility showed up clearly in national surveys. A significant share of us adults reported that they could not cover a $400 emergency without borrowing, selling something, or missing payments. This included many households with stable employment and dual incomes. That statistic matters because $400 is not a catastrophe. It is a car repair, a medical bill, a utility, something routine. When a household cannot absorb a routine shock, it is not resilient. It is operating at the limit. At that limit, every additional stressor compounds. Missed work due to illness leads to lost income. Lost income leads to missed payments. Missed payments trigger fees, penalties, and interest. What looks like a personal failure from the outside is, internally, a cascade. This is why dual-income households are not safer. They are brittle. They function efficiently under ideal conditions, but systems omit for efficiency without margin collapse under volatility. And volatility is not an anomaly. It is a certainty. What makes this dangerous is that it isn't isolated. The same forces that destabilize households also reinforce the system that created the risk. Once a system reaches this level of fragility, it does not merely trap individuals. It begins to reinforce itself. Housing is the clearest example when two-income households became the norm. Purchasing power doubled almost overnight. Not for better houses. For the same houses, the supply did not change. The number of bidders did. Families did not suddenly want larger homes. They wanted access. Access to safe neighborhoods, access to stable communities, access to schools that would not limit their children's future. Because public education in the United States is largely funded by property taxes, school quality became tied to housing pros. Good schools clustered in expensive zip codes. That turned home on hip into a proxy tuition system. The logic was brutal but rational. If a household could use two incomes to outbid another family for a home in a strong school district, it would. Everyone did. And when everyone does, the price of admission rises. This is not speculation. It is what happens in any competitive market where purchasing power increases faster than supply. Prices adjust upward until the marginal buyer is fully stretched. Two incomes became the baseline requirement. At that point, opting out was no longer a neutral choice. Choosing a cheaper home often meant choosing weaker schools, longer commutes, fewer services, and lower perceived opportunity. System penalized restraint. The same feedback loop appeared in credit markets. Banks did not force households to borrow more. They simply offered larger loans based on combined income. A household that qualified for a $300,000 mortgage on one income could now qualify for $400,000 or $500,000 with two. That new ceiling quietly became the new floor. Once larger loans were normalized, smaller ones felt like underutilization. Families did not borrow to excess because they were irresponsible. They borrowed because the system framed higher leverage as reasonable. Transportation followed the same pattern. Dual employment increased. VO to Benson's, VO empowerment. Fixed costs reinforced the need for both incomes. Each loop strengthened the next. Over time, the economy adapted around this configuration. Employers assumed constant availability from both partners. Benefits became tied to full-time employment. House-there access became dependent on uninterrupted. And once locked in, the household lost the ability to de-escalate. Reducing income did not simply reduce comfort. It threatened the entire framework that daily life depended on. This is why telling families to just earn more never solves the problem. Additional income does not restore margin in a system that absorbs purchasing power as soon as it appears. It only raises the stakes. The trap is not maintained by bad decisions. It is maintained by feedback loops that punish deviation and reward full participation. And systems like that do not unwind gently. They persist until something breaks. Once you see how these loops operate, the question stops being how to earn more and starts becoming what security actually means inside the system. At this point, the mistake is easy to make. It is tempting to believe the problem is income level, that if the numbers were higher, the pressure would ease, that one more raise, one more promotion, one more year of grinding would finally create safety. But income was never the missing variable. Flexibility was. Financial security is not the absence of struggle. It is the presence of margin. It is the ability to absorb disruption without the structure collapsing. It is having unused capacity when something goes wrong. The single-income household of the past was not secure because it earned more. It was secure because it operated below its maximum capacity. One income carried the system. The second remained dormant, not wasted. Preserved modern dual-income households reverse that logic. They operate at full deployment by default. Every dollar is assigned before it arrives. Every hour is monetized. Every capacity is consumed. That is why the system feels stable right up until it fails. The households that eventually regain stability do not do so by earning dramatically more. They do it by rebuilding margin. They reduce the portion of life that requires constant income flow. They structure fixed costs so that survival does not depend on perfect continuity. When fixed costs can be carried by one income, the second income changes character. It stops being infrastructure. It becomes optional. It becomes flexible. It becomes a buffer rather than a requirement. Over time, something else happens. Money that is not required for survival can compound. Emergency funds stop being theoretical. Investment income begins to supplement labor income. Options reappear, not immediately, not painlessly, but predictably. This is the quiet inversion at the end of the system's logic. The very thing households believed two incomes would provide at the beginning, least security, choice, resilience, wrongly appears when income is no longer fully consumed by structure. The trap was never about working too little or spending too much. It was about building a life that required perfection to sustain. And perfection is not a strategy. It is a liability. A system that only works when nothing goes wrong is not strong. It is fragile. Once that becomes clear, the story changes. Not because circumstances suddenly improve, but because the definition of success does. Security is no longer measured by how much comes in. It is measured by how much is not required. And once you see that distinction, the system reveals itself for what it is. Not a personal failure, a structural one.